My name is Prasant Mohabatra. I am the Vice Chancellor of Research. This talk is a part of the newly established Distinguished Speaker Series in Research and Innovation, which is hosted by Office of Research. It is second in that series of talk. And this is designed for our campus faculty, staff, and students to hear and engage from luminaries in both academic research as well as industry innovations, where we highlight the works of a diverse group of leaders in a variety of disciplinary areas, where the research and achievements have an impact on the society through the advancement of knowledge, scientific research, and evidence-based decision making. And the other purpose of this seminar series is to bring in the campus researchers to have an afternoon of engaging yourself, form your own network. So we will have an hour of reception and we'll provide refreshment at the end of the talk. So please hang around after the talk. So it's certainly my distinct honor to introduce the afternoon speakers, Tom Chi. Tom Chi has worked in a wide range of roles starting from astrophysical researcher to Fortune 500 consultant to corporate executive developing new hardware and software products and services. He played a significant role in established projects with global reach, such as Microsoft Outlook, Yahoo Search, and scaled new projects from conception to significance, such as growing the Yahoo Answers from 0 to 90 million users. Tom has pioneered and practiced a unique approach to rapid prototyping, visioning, and leadership that can jumpstart innovative new ideas, as well as move large organizations at unprecedented speeds. These approaches have benefited over a dozen industry-leading companies. He most recently served as the head of the product development at Google X, where he was developing technologies such as Google Glasses and Google SelfDriving Cars. One of his current focus is working with social and environmental entrepreneurs around the globe, and that I think will be the main theme of his talk today, where he's rebooting the fundamental frameworks of entrepreneurship itself and coaching and teaching a limited number of value-aligned organizations and leaders. He's also spearheading a biocarbon engineering effort to plant 1 billion trees using drones, 1 billion trees per year using drones. Friends, please join me in welcoming Tom Chi.
I turned on this mic. Oh, it is working. Well, I don't need to do anything. So check it out. All right, so zooming out to the very furthest view, here's the whole Earth. And here's a stat that, actually given that we're at Davis, you may already know this, but here's a stat that I didn't know until I made this presentation, which is since the beginning of agriculture, the human population has increased by more than 1,000-fold, going from about 7 million before agriculture to it's like 7.6 billion today. And I think as soon as people hear this stat, a bunch of things come to mind. One of them is, well, maybe it's just too late. Maybe we just have too many people on the planet. We didn't have so many freaking people on the planet. Like if there was a moral way for there to be less people on the planet, then that would be really helpful. So, and you guys are probably familiar with this narrative, limits to growth. There's the whole narrative around like, we're using 3 Earths worth of this resource and 10 Earths of this resource. And this is such a pervasive narrative that I think it affects a lot of how we think of climate and environment. But I'm going to go challenge the narrative a little bit, and maybe in a way that you haven't heard before. So if you were to take the total biomass of all of humanity, so basically take all the people and put them together and say how much mass is that, basically comes out to about 350 million tons. And it turns out that if you take the biomass of all ants, so just grab all the ants, put them together, say how much mass is that, it's also roughly 350 million tons. So there's about as much biomass of ants in the world as humans. So that's one way that we're similar. But one way that we're really different is humans eat less than 3% of their body weight per day, so 2.8% on average. By comparison, ants eat roughly 30% of their body weight every day. So that means if you do the math, ants are literally eating 10 times more of the planet than us every single day. But we're not sitting around thinking to ourselves, oh my gosh, you know what the biggest problem in the world is right now? Ant overpopulation. They're eating 10 times more than us, they're ruining the planet. And ants are a pretty good proxy because they're omnivores. They eat animals and plants. This is not a vegetarian type argument. They're social organisms. They organize reasonably complex societies for insects. And you throw this together, it's like, how in the world are they consuming 10 times more of the planet than us? But we don't have a problem with that. Well, it's just for the simple fact that in the process of ants consuming 10 times more of the planet than us every day, at least in terms of how much food they eat, then they actually provide a huge amount of ecosystem services. They aerate the soils, they recycle nutrients, they're doing a ton of things. Some of them are active farmers, right? Some ants are actively farming, things, aphids and fungi and all these different things in their nests. They're amazing, right? And basically, the reason that we are not complaining about ant overpopulation is they're following a really simple rule. They are following the rule of, in the process of consuming 10 times more of the earth than us, they are providing more ecosystem services than net ecosystem consumption. And therefore, we don't freak out. They can eat 10 times more than us. Heck, they can eat 100 times more than us. And as long as they were following this rule, we'd actually be fine with it. And not only is this the rule that ants follow, it's basically the rule that all of life follows, except for us pretty recently, right? So over the last couple thousand years, we've departed from this rule. But for the most part, for most of human history, and for all of the history of most of life, life has been following this rule of every organism providing more ecosystem services than ecosystem consumption. Now, it leads to kind of an interesting question that we might look at today together, which is, well, if we're the only folks that have kind of dropped out of following this rule, what does it look like for humanity to try to follow this rule? What would it look like for, as an overall species, for us to be providing more ecosystem services than consumption? Or in other words, how does humanity become a net positive to nature? How do we make it so that every single year that humanity exists, nature is healthier because we exist? And I know that sounds like very far-fetched because we've been struggling with we're just destroying everything. Let's be less damaging. Well, maybe we could be less damaging to the point that we are sustainable. And sustainable to me sounds like an uneasy truce. It's like you're taking exactly what you give, or you're taking it just slowly enough that it's replenishing. But it's just not really the same thing as being a net positive to the thing that you are drawing from, right? This is all the way on the other side, the other valence of this thing. And it goes and poses this, maybe sounds like a radical question, but you can flip this around and it sounds not radical at all if you think about it this way. If humanity does not achieve this, then there will be a death date for civilization, right? So let's say humanity was just even a little bit negative cumulatively to nature. Let's say humanity was 0.1% negative to nature every single year, cumulatively. Well, that means you got 1,000 years before you're done, right? There will be a death date to that civilization, and it's 1,000 years. Right now, we're more than 0.1% negative, so our date is a little closer than 1,000 years. And definitely all throughout history, if you look at the rise and falls of civilizations and empires, you will see points where they kind of drew too much of their resources, and there was a death date to their civilization. Whether they realized it, the actual, month of, or they noticed it when these trends started happening 10 years prior, they basically got into a zone of drawing a lot more down than they were replenishing, and intrinsically they were programming in a death date. So really, if we are going to be on this planet for the next 1,000 or million years, we're going to need to have figured this out at some point. We are going to end up becoming this civilization at some point if we're going to keep surviving. Now, if you did want to end up there, though, you got to go start with, well, how close are we right now? And I'm not going to get into all the details on everything. This is just, tracking some of the carbon. There's a lot of ways that we are negative to nature. And I characterize nature under 4 different categories. It's basically air, water, soil, biodiversity. And we're a pretty significant negative across all 4 of those things right now. But just looking at air and atmospheric composition for a bit, I think this graph really synthesizes it out. It wrapped a little bit weirdly, but I can just talk through what we're seeing here. So if you look over on the left-hand side of this graph, is this a laser? Oh, it's a there we go. If you look at the left-hand side of this graph, then we had about 280 parts per million in the atmosphere in the year 1750. So before the Industrial Revolution really started taking hold, this was the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. Then through a couple practices since then, the burning of coal, oil, and gas, the production of cement, changes to land use, we basically added this many gigatons of carbon dioxide and incrementally added this many parts per million to the atmosphere. So this entire arc on the left is the entire history of industrial production of humanity up until now. And this is all these human activities on the left-hand side. And actually, if we were left to our own devices and nature was not helping us at all, we'd already be in ridiculous trouble. Like, if you just look at how much we've been net emitting since the Industrial Revolution, we'd already be up at 507 parts per million roughly. So we'd be effectively on an unlivable planet already. But luckily, we were not alone. Nature came in and the ecosystem had a number of responses that helped us out. So the ocean absorbed 582 gigatons. The land absorbed about 650 gigatons. And then the remainder, about 1,000 gigatons, so 1 trillion tons, is still up in the atmosphere right now, which is why the concentration in the atmosphere should jump from 280 before the Industrial Revolution to about 409, 410 today. And it's this stuff that's left in the atmosphere right now which is driving major weather and climate destabilization. So we obviously are very concerned about this part here. And even though the ocean and the land has kind of been saving our butts, well, the absorption of the ocean hasn't been completely harmless either, because it has led to a net increase in acidity of the overall ocean. There's a lot of water in there, but the net acidity of the entire ocean has gone up by 30% since the Industrial Revolution. So we've really been trying to put a lot of carbon in there, because there's a lot of ocean to go put that carbon into before you would end up acidifying the ocean by 30%. And we're on a strong trajectory to keep on increasing that as more carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean. Now, looking at the history of the Industrial Revolution like this also gives us a pretty good look at what we would need to do to repair these things, right? We would need to get 1 trillion. Well, number one, we would need to stop emitting so aggressively, because if you don't stop the stuff on the left-hand side, we're going to just keep on recreating these problems and intensifying these problems. But on the right-hand side, we've got to pay off about 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And eventually, we're going to need to pay off more than 500 billion that is in the shallow ocean. Beyond the stuff that's happening to the atmosphere, we're seeing some real on-the-ground effects. Two-thirds of the Great Barrier Reef was wiped out between the year 2015 and 2017. And coral scientists estimate that we've got about 35 years before we wipe out all shallow water reefs on the planet. And in the process of doing that, we are immediately going to extinct 25% of all species in the ocean that live directly on the reefs. And we are going to, at minimum, disrupt, but maybe also extinct 15% more species in the ocean that have either their food chain or reproduction chain highly dependent on the reefs. So it means within 35 years, we are talking about extincting somewhere between 25 to 40% of everything in the ocean. And I don't know, I expect to be alive in 30 years, so this is happening real soon. This is not one of those things where, before I started looking at this, because I came onto this issue because I also live in Hawaii part of the year, and I live right next to a coral reef, which just suddenly died. It went from totally healthy to completely dead and gone, gray and brown and no fish in less than 2 months. And when I dug into what the cause was, it was nothing other than thermal stress. Basically, the entire oceans are warming. And not only did my reef die that year, 10% of all reefs on the planet died that year. And when 10% of a large natural resource can all die in 1 year, then I got real concerned. I started talking to coral scientists about it, and they're like, yep. I mean, we've been having these bleaching events, like a larger percentage, higher frequency, it's intensifying. I was like, how much time we got left? And like 30, 35 years. So you look at this, and for me, it was a very important turning point, because before this, I had always heard of the climate discussion as something where it's like, oh, by the year 2100, maybe we're going to have this average increase in sea level, maybe we're going to have this average increase in global temperatures. But in practice, way before the year 2100, we're going to make a bunch of completely irreversible changes that, if we extinct coral, it's going to be 15 to 20 million years before it re-evolves. And I don't know how much faith you have in humanity. I don't have total faith that we're going to see through 20 million years to see coral again if we extinct it, right? Possible, but we're not that civilization yet. And when you start to understand that this is a irreversible change that's happening real soon, not even in the year 2100, that you start to recognize, well, we kind of need to get on this much faster than we have been. The other thing that I think has been accidentally misleading, and it's nobody's fault in particular, but when you talk about average sea level rise and average temperature rise, it hides most of how people will experience things. Because people kind of thought, well, a half a degree warmer, in your mind you just think, well, it's like, it's on average a half a degree warmer every day. And for most, environments, that's not a big issue. But what a half a degree warmer actually means for a lot of places on the planet is 5 degrees warmer in the summer, 4 degrees colder in the winter. Like, the volatility is actually increasing much faster than the averages are. And we are going to experience climate primarily through volatility changes and not through average changes, right? So just the discussion of averages has been the wrong rhetoric to go understand this issue. And this is why you get 110 degrees in Paris. This is why you get a month of 90-degree weather in Scandinavia. These are things that have never happened in history, period. Okay, this is how you get close to 130 degrees in India. These are things that just have not happened. And now we are going to experience them as crazy volatility over the coming decades. So the damage is real large, and the time frame is kind of short. So let's go back to that prompt. What the heck are we going to do if all this is the case? Like, how could we plausibly try to become a net positive to nature? Well, in order to go talk about this, I'm going to take a step back and give you a little bit more about my background, but really just like 30 seconds. But I was one of the founding team members of Google X. I helped to create the self-driving car, Google Glass, Project Balloon, the contact lens that measures your glucose levels, the new approach to artificial intelligence called semi-supervised learning that learns a little bit like how a toddler learns. Doesn't matter. But we basically created this moonshot factory where we were doing really intensive innovation and inventing new things. And I'm going to draw a distinction for you. There's a bunch of inventions which are kind of like the better mousetrap kind of invention. Things work a certain way, and you change the invention around, and now it works 10% better. And that's cool. That's a better mousetrap type invention. But in Google X, we really specialized in a type of invention which was in a different category than that, which I call an invention catalyst. So these are things that you go and change the invention, and not only does it make that invention work a little differently or work a little better in a particular way, it changes something fundamental enough that it forces you to rethink how the entire system around that invention works. So for example, we worked on the self-driving car. And for folks who have been following the news, the self-driving car program is officially live in parts of Arizona now. So no safety drivers, thing fully autonomous going around in Arizona. You can sign up for the service depending on where you live. Now, when we were working on this problem, is a self-driving car just the same thing as a regular car but 5% better? Of course not. right? A self-driving car does something that's pretty radically different than what cars have been doing in the past, and it allowed us to start thinking about the system around cars differently and in the following way. So if you look at the average car is utilized about 4 to 5% of the time. Most of the time that you own a car, it's sitting in a garage somewhere. It might be at home, might be in the parking lot at work, but you're driving the car less than 5% of the time. The utilization is super low. Now, if you had self-driving cars as a large percentage of the fleet, there'd be a lot of people that wouldn't need to own cars anymore. They could just like punch up the sort of car that they need. Oh, I'm going to Home Depot for some home improvement. I want to order up a pickup truck. And that's what rolls up in front of your door when you walk outside. Oh, I'm going on a hot date. I'm going to order a sports car, right? So like you can get to a type of utility of transportation, but also, more importantly, a utilization of transportation that is much higher. A shared vehicle, which is self-driving and showing up at various people's houses in order to go take care of their transportation needs, instead of everybody owning their own vehicle, is a world where you might be able to move from 4% utilization to, let's say, 40% utilization, and still have plenty of time for charging, maintenance, all that sort of thing. And in that world where you move from 4% utilization to 40%, you're getting 10 times more use out of every car, which actually means the total number of cars that you need to get the same transportation utility starts to go down. Right now, because a lot of people want to go to work around rush hour, it won't go down by 10x just because you increase utilization by 10x, but it might go down by 5x. You might very conceivably bring down the number of cars by 70 or 80%. And just think about what a New York City or San Francisco or a, Jakarta, they have terrible traffic. Think about what that city looks like, works like, if 80% of the cars actually get removed. And we thought about this way back in the day when we were working on the car, and we used to joke that eventually, once these things became a significant percentage of the auto mix, we would start going around to cities around the world to all the signs that say parking lot and erase the trailing letters so it just leaves the word park. Right? Because 15 to 20% of the surfaces inside the cities are parking. And imagine you could reclaim like 20% of the city and turn it into green spaces, public spaces, community spaces. It's a completely different city as soon as you're able to do that. Right? So something that could have been just a slightly better mousetrap, by being 10% better, ended up being a catalyst. It could lead to a dramatic reduction in the number of cars, a dramatic reduction in required parking space, way better transportation, utility in terms of the sorts of cars that you get to interact with, and better utilization. And that's an example of an invention catalyst being able to have a catalytic effect on the design of an overall system. And you do that for a while, we'll start designing cities differently as a function of cars working like this. Now we're going to take that same idea of invention catalyst, and we're going to take it out of the realm of Google X and just doing some cool tech, and move it into the question of what does it look like for humanity to become a net positive to nature. And let's look at some potential invention catalysts in that space. So an example of an invention catalyst, so I'm an early investor and advisor to this team. They're called Dendra Systems. They used to be called Biocarbon Engineering. That is using drones in order to do large-scale reforestation, afforestation, and ecosystem restoration. And basically, each one of their drones is able to plant 120 trees per minute at 1/10 the cost it currently costs to plant a tree. So it's roughly 100 times faster, 10 times cheaper than the ways that people are planting trees right now. Now, in the presence of that sort of invention, what might you be able to do that you weren't able to do before? Well, if you look at, if you guys remember back to this graph back here, we got 1 trillion tons to go pay off, right? 1 trillion tons up in the atmosphere, plus a little bit more than 0.5 trillion in the ocean. And if you look at a tree, trees at maturity weigh between 2 to 20 tons. And they are roughly 50% carbon by mass as a function of cellulose versus lignin content, but it's pretty darn close to 50%. Could be a little bit more or less depending on their proportion. And given that they're roughly 50% carbon by mass and they weigh 2 to 20 tons, a tree at maturity represents 1 to 10 tons of carbon. And that carbon and you guys know this, you're in ag school, that carbon doesn't come from the soil. Almost all of it comes from fixing the air, right? So 95+% of the mass of a plant comes from crystallizing the air, basically. So trees are effectively just crystallized air. That they're not getting, any large percentage of their mass from the soil, tiny percentages, low single digits. And in fact, if trees did get most of their mass from the soil, there'd be a tree-sized hole under every tree. But there's not. Like, actually, trees bulge out where they are because they're fixing all this mass from the air to become what they're becoming. So let's say you've got, each tree representing 1 to 10 tons of carbon that's fixed from the atmosphere, and you can somehow plant 1 trillion of those. Well, 1 trillion 2-ton trees at 1 ton of carbon each, sequestered for them is the 1 trillion tons that you're looking to pay down. And this is rough math. Like, in practice, if you planted trees that had, that were heavier, more massive and had more sequestration potential, you wouldn't even need to plant 1 trillion. But let's go run through the 1 trillion number with the, with the drones that we have right now. So with the drones that we have right now, if we wanted to plant 1 trillion trees in 50 years, which is 20 billion per year, then it would only take about 9,000 drones and 450 people on staff. And I'm excluding seed costs because depending on the seed, some seeds you get like 20 or 50 of them for a penny, and then other seeds might be a whole dollar a seed. It really depends. So we're just going to throw that to the side for a moment. But if you just look at the OpEx of running those drones and paying that staff, it only takes about $80 million per year. Oh, this is 9,000 drones, 450 staff, working 250 days a year, 5-hour days. Right? So this is very within our operating parameters for how we've been planting all around the world already. But just kind of scaling up to more drones and more people. Well, if you do all that, it only takes about $80 million of operating costs in order to put 20 billion trees into the ground every year. And you do that for 50 years, and you're kind of done with the planting that you need to get done. I'm of course skipping a bunch of details of exactly where to put them and so on and so forth. We can get into the details because we've already planted on 4 different continents. We support 150 different types of species. We're getting good germination and survival rates. We planted, ranging all the way to, coastal mud flats doing like mangrove restoration in southern Myanmar, all the way to rocky outcroppings in Wales to the Amazon rainforest. We planted in a bunch of environments and successfully got these ecosystems a jump start. But you look at this, and it's an example of a catalyst where we might be able to change a lot about that 1 trillion tons in the atmosphere just in the presence of using a single invention in a new way. Now, another invention catalyst. So this is another portfolio company. So I find and invest and support in a bunch of organizations that I think can be catalytic toward having humanity become a net positive nature. And this company is called Iron Ox. They basically do fully robotic agriculture from seed to harvest. And this is really useful for a lot of the foods that we eat. So at the time that we took this photo, they were growing about 3 dozen different types of crops. So a bunch of leafy greens, some root vegetables, some fruiting vegetables. So basically the way that it works is there's all these grow trays, which you see at the bottom. And then this transport bot goes and brings the grow tray over to the farmer bot. So here's the farmer bot. The farmer bot has got these stereoscopic, multi-spec cameras and a couple other sensors in their sensor pack. And they also have a swappable end effector to be able to go tend to the plants in various ways. So basically the grow tray comes over, it gets dropped in front of the farmer bot, and then the farmer bot goes plant to plant and tends each plant. So it looks at the plant, looks around it, tends it, looks at the plant, tends it. So every one of these plants can get personal robotic attention every single day. And it actually leads to some possibilities in agriculture that we haven't had before. So the way that our workflow works in terms of programming the computer, programming the robot to grow new plants is we have plant scientists and agronomists on staff in this company. And they will go and take a new seed and they'll start tending it, basically by hand. And as they're tending it by hand, there'll be a roboticist sitting right next to them, just jotting down every single thing that they're doing. Oh, what are you doing now? Well, we're soaking the seed to do this. What are you doing now? We're transporting it to this. What are you doing now? Well, we look to see if there's this sort of thing under the leaf, and if this thing is under the leaf, the minimum we should prune it. If it's out of control, we should compost it. I was like, well, great. So they're writing down all these different tasks, and that becomes their robotic automation task list. So we are north of 80% optimization on growing all of these plants, and we're pretty sure that we're going to easily clear 95% automation, which means you need almost no labor to go grow these plants at some point. Now, this is appropriate for a lot of food crops. It is not appropriate for large, huge acreage row crops like corn and soy, and at least not yet. But but this can be extremely impactful. This is indoors at the moment, but it's actually meant to be greenhouse automation. Just for Rev 1, it was indoors because that was the building we could get. But Rev 2, we are building a large-scale warehouse facility in Watsonville right now, producing at a scale that would be interesting to sell in stores. We've already been selling all the produce in stores on the peninsula so far, and we are extremely supply limited because the stuff tastes really good and people keep buying it. And as soon as we go and stock the thing, they're out in 2 days and they want more. So this is definitely producing high quality, tasty things. Now, what the heck does this have to do with becoming a net positive to nature? Well, at the moment, we use 40% of the total land surface of the Earth to grow our food, and over 50% of the habitable land on Earth. So if you exclude Antarctica and some things that we do not generally consider habitable. Though it hit 65 degrees in Antarctica recently. Anyways, separate story. But more than 50% of the habitable land on Earth we use for growing food. And because of it, that's actually the main reason that we're encroaching and destroying habitat. People have the mistaken notion that the Amazon rainforest is being cut down because of these greedy loggers trying to go get all this timber. That's not true. The actual timber use, the destruction of the Amazon that's going to use of wood and timber is 5%. Almost all of it, the Amazon destruction, they don't even bother with the trees. They just burn them down in order to go and plant soybeans and graze cattle. So it's purely food production. So to the extent that we can begin looking at food production in a very different way. And one last thing about this before we move on. Because these things are able to be planted at a tiny seedling spacing and then move to an adolescent spacing and then move to an adult spacing, then we're able to grow them at a density which is way, way higher, even though this is not vertical multi-stack, because if you end up stacking them vertically, you can't use sunlight anymore. You need to use grow lights, and then your OpEx is out the door because you need to power all those lights. But just in this one layer of compression, we can grow 30 acres of food in 1 acre of footprint. And if you look at something like that, then if you follow those calculations, it means that you can cover the caloric needs of a city of 100,000 people year-round using just 2.5 square miles. So you can imagine a totally different sort of agricultural setup where a lot of the major cities decide to become food independent by grabbing 10 square miles that are 50 miles out of town, right? You move far enough out of town that the real estate starts to get cheap again. Go buy 10 square miles, 15 square miles, and then produce this, and you cover your city of 1 million people. All right. So other catalytic inventions that I'm an investor for, so I'm an investor in Memphis Meats, which is basically, instead of growing a cow to make a steak, you just start with some cow cells and you grow the steak, or in this case a meatball and a chicken strip. It tastes like chicken and it tastes like beef because it is chicken and it is beef. And yes, this is one of the things that I would like us to use to go replace factory farming. Because in a factory farming context, we're basically treating the animals like little machines anyway. It's like, well, we're going to cut off your beaks, or we're going to pack you in so tight you can't turn around. We're basically treating them like big rows of machines that we're going to extract meat and milk from, that kind of thing. And this, if you're going to treat it like a machine anyway, you might as well just run it like a machine, right? You might as well grow it, in big vats the way that we make beer and yogurt and other sorts of things. Obviously, there are some interesting scaling challenges that the team moved from bottle level bioreactors up to barrel level bioreactors, and now we're looking looking at, full-scale bioreactors for this, which is another big leap. But getting to barrel size is already getting to some interesting production volumes, more for like the restaurant scale industry. Now, even though I just showed you a bunch of indoor things that are about like stabilizing our food production, I do believe that one of our best bets, probably our literal best bet for sequestering a trillion tons, is to put a lot of it into the soil. And these are some photos from Gabe Brown's ranch. I went out there with a team of soil scientists, and we took a ton of soil cores and characterized the health of his soil in a bunch of different ways. This is an audience that totally understands all these things, so this is great. I can skip all the steps. So you guys know what Horizon A soil is. They were averaging like 28, 29 inches of Horizon A soil. That's freaking crazy, right? Like you don't find farms where that's the case. Who the heck has got more than 2 feet of topsoil? And this is starting from soil that looked like this. This is his neighbor's farm, and his farm basically started in that same condition. And 15 years later, he's got more than 2 feet of topsoil. Now, in addition to that, you guys probably know dry soil water infiltration, right? Which is a pretty good measure of the holding capacity and the moisture capturing capacity of your soils. And in the average American farm, it's about, you can do about a ½ an inch of rainfall in an hour before you start to get significant runoff or erosion. If you got an inch in an hour, you're definitely getting runoff from your fields. If you do ½ an inch, spread over an hour, then a lot of times the soil can absorb it. And dry soil water infiltration is a good measurement that gives you a sense of how the soil would perform in that situation. Well, we did the dry soil water infiltration test on Gabe's land. It was 52 inches in an hour before it would run off. That's crazy. That's not even close to the national average. Right? The difference between ½ an inch and 52 inches is just a completely different ballpark. And you see these soils here, his neighbors, so when I went to visit him, they were on their 3rd year of continuous drought. His land in the last calendar year when I visited had received a total of 5.2 inches of rain for the whole year. Right, so his neighbor's soil looked exactly like this, and a bunch of them had stopped producing. They're like, we just can't do it anymore. 5 inches of rain in a year, we're just not doing it. His soil still had rain in it from 5 years ago. Right, it was continuing to be verdant and supporting a rich multi-cropping, kind of setup that was deriving lots of revenue and margin for him after 3 years of continuous drought. And this is the place that we can eventually get to, both in terms of agricultural resilience, in terms of soil sequestration, like the top 2 meters of soil around the world. So it doesn't include any deep water stuff. This is all terrestrial soil. The top 2 meters of soils around the world contain close to 10 trillion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent inside of them. So that's more than 10 times what is needed to go pay off the debt that we've created so far since the Industrial Revolution. So we could take all of agricultural, if we could take all of terrestrial soils and move them up by 10, 11%, that would totally pay the debt. Now, given that we don't farm every single square inch that is up there, cropland is like 11%, then you would need to do more like a double of the carbon on all of cropland, and that would also fully pay off 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. All right, and I find these practices to be catalytic, though there is no robot or technology single thing that you can point at. There's a bunch of knowledge in Gabe's head. You guys probably, for you guys, this is probably no big deal, but for me, this blew my mind. Because he went out there and he scooped up some soil and he smelled it and he told me what exactly was going on with it. And I was like, and he asked me to smell it, and I was like, okay. And then he asked me to smell the other soil. I could tell it smelled differently. But he was like, okay, and this is what's going on with nitrogen, and this is going on, and I was like, damn, okay. Well, that's all in your head, but I wish if that was in everybody's head, we'd be done with the climate crisis in 15 years. All right, so I mentioned coral reefs. I am also working on this one as well. This is kind of a 3-step plan. The overall oceans are getting too warm, so we are working on breeding heat resistant heat-resistant coral. I'm an investor in a company that is creating these next-generation coral nurseries that can speed up the growth of individual coral organisms through a process called hyperfragmentation. And then I just put in for an NSF grant to go and work on a robot to go, though I already produced the first couple robots, to go plant corals. So just a robot that crawls around a reef like a lobster and plants a bunch of corals. So if you could go kind of combine all three of these things together, you got something interesting, right? Like, let's make these heat-resistant corals, let's produce a ton of them in nursery, and let's use these little lobster robots to go plant them. And not exactly, where they are, let's move them up like 3 degrees latitude. So you're moving in water that is going to be cooler for a longer period of time. And buy yourself a couple more decades before thermal stress wipes out that run. All right, we're just gonna run through the rest of it because we're moving into marine stuff. You could also potentially do these large-scale marine permaculture arrays on 2% of the ocean surface. And that would also pay off 1 trillion tons within 50 years. But we don't know how to engineer these that well yet, but we do have the first pilots happening in Indonesia right now. And then I'm gonna do one last thing, and then we're going to, well, actually there's one story after this one. So one other catalyst that people may not be thinking about, but I wanted to include it because it is so different than the other ones. So this is an image from this is like a toast that was happening after a conference that I went to during the day, where they were speaking about Ecuador, because this is on a hilltop in Quito, in Ecuador. And I was out there to go speak to a bunch of entrepreneurs that were part of this emerging Latin American social entrepreneur ecosystem. But at the same time, there was a conference that had a lot of overlap in terms of people. That was the 10-year anniversary of the addition that changed the Ecuadorian constitution that gave fundamental rights to nature. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but 10 years ago, Ecuador was in major economic trouble. They moved away from the peso to the dollar. They rewrote chunks of their constitution. And one of the things that they wrote in their constitution is that nature, just like human beings, have fundamental rights. And that includes the right to be able to replenish and restore themselves. Nature, so they just added like 2 sentences to their constitution. And that sounds like, okay, what the heck is that going to do? But over the course of, from that being in there 10 years ago, that actually came up in court in a bunch of cases. These people want to drill here, these people want to mine here, these people want to divert this river, these people want to deforest this area, et cetera, et cetera. And nature didn't win all the cases, but nature won some of those cases. So like, they're now establishing case law where just, by adding a sentence or two into a constitution, they're now establishing case law, which is, changing the precedents going forward in Ecuador as to ways that you can defend nature and what nature is allowed to do and the rights and the voice that it has in the conversation. And I throw this out here because it's a different type of catalyst, right? It's a catalyst that is happening inside of people's worldviews about like how they consider the world around them. And that can also have a material impact that goes and kind of marries up with some of the technical invention catalysts. And I'm going to share one more story. This one comes from work that I was doing in Guatemala. So this is a company that does, they do these solar electric boxes which go and power up a household. And if you look on the left-hand side, like that's what we're replacing. So there's these candles that people were using, and it was actually taking a large percentage of their income, like 30% of their income was just going to candles that they would use to go light their house. And these are for populations in northern Guatemala. Well, there's so much stuff to go cover. How do I cover all this? Okay, so in Guatemala, there's 26 languages that are spoken. Only one of them is Spanish. The other 25 are passed down, indigenous languages from the Mayans. And like if you go and to the areas where people speak those languages, this, by the UN Development Index, it's some of the poorest people in the world because they don't even speak Spanish to go access government services in Guatemala. So the great majority of these people live on less than $1 a day, have never had electricity in their houses at all. Their houses, if you visit them, typically do not have floors, so during the rainy season, you're just standing in 6 to 8 inches of mud, and that's just what it's like to be at home in that part of the world. Now, this company, the founder of this company, his grandma was one of those people. And he remembered that, and he wanted to go back and serve those communities. Though he now speaks Spanish and lives in Guatemala City, he remembered that. But he's like, I want to go back to where my grandma's from, I want to help those people. So he created this solar electric box, and we took it out to those communities, and it was extremely exciting for them. So many people wanted it, but you live on $1 a day, and this box costs like $110. So what's the likelihood that you're going to go buy that? Like, a lot of people wanted it, they couldn't buy it. So we worked with the Guatemalan Central Bank, and we said, hey, if you can help us do some underwriting, we can get a lot of these boxes out there. And the Guatemalan Bank was like, sure, we can do these loans. Like, go ahead and create some underwriting parameters, we'll work it out. So we worked it out with them, and then we said we're open for business. And we got so many requests that we 3x'd the total underwriting capacity of the entire Central Bank of Guatemala. There were so many more people that wanted this than we could clear through this sort of financing that eventually we're like, well, this is not how we're going to help everybody. We're going to get some systems out there like that, but we're not going to be able to help that many people. Now we get to the point of the story. That was a lot of background. So what we ended up doing is we ended up changing it so that instead of it being like a $110 box that you buy, and most of the folks could not buy, we made it so that there was just a tiny deposit you would need to put down, $3, $5, something that you could actually save for. And for $5, we would actually deliver the box to your house, and from that point on, we would charge you for the electricity, and you would pay for the electricity as you go. Now, we purposely priced the cost of 1 week of electricity to be significantly less than the cost of 1 week of candles, because they were already paying that stuff, right? So if you could afford a tiny down payment, then you're instantly saving money every single week for the rest of all of the time, right? And with that, we're able to go, we're able to get this out there to tons and tons of people. Now, here's the interesting mind shift twist. So I've been, my background is in physics and electrical engineering. I've built a lot of hardware in my life, and all of you guys would probably have like a cell phone or some piece of hardware that you personally own. And if you have your cell phone for 5 years, it's a piece of garbage, right? That's just true. Like, any cell phone that you keep for 5 years basically becomes garbage. Now, what's happening there? Well, behind the scenes, there's a bunch of electronics engineers and designers that are trying to go figure out how your phone is designed. And we are incentivized in the following way. When the only point that we make money from selling you a gadget is at the point of retail purchase, right? Just in that moment, we make the money. What happens to it after that? Who the heck knows? If it breaks in 5 years, whatever, man, we already made the money up front. And because of it, we are incentivized to do the following. You have the retail price you can sell it at, and then you have the thing that's called the bill of materials, which is the cost of all the materials and processes that are required to go produce that phone. Given that we make all of our money at the point of sale, we are incentivized to make the bill of materials as cheap as possible. So this is us going through, it's like, oh, that's got a metal part, we can replace that with injection molded plastic. Oh, this has got, this gauge of wire. Well, let's use a thinner wire. That would still work. Oh, this amplifier has got a mean time to failure of 15 years. We don't need 15 years. Let's grab the amplifier that has a mean time to failure of 7 years. That's fine, right? And all these things save us 3 pennies here, 10 pennies here, so on and so forth. And you add all those things together, and you get a thing that cannot help but break within 2 to 5 years. So anything that you buy today basically is matching that incentive, and it is likely going to be trashed in 5 years. Now, in this setup, we did the following calculation. Remember, we're putting it out there, and the people are paying as they go, which actually means the longer that this device can exist in the wild, the more money that we're going to make off of it. And I did the simple calculation that if we could add $5 to the device and extend its life by more than 6 months, it would totally be worth it. So we went down that bomb list and we did the exact opposite. We went to every component that had a low mean time to failure, and we swapped it out with a higher quality component with a higher mean time to failure. We looked at the plastic enclosures that might break or weren't cracked or what have you, and we replaced them with, well, this is anodized aluminum, whatever. Like, we replaced them with things that were way sturdier. And at the end of the day, we ended up adding $11 to the price of the box. But we have a box that has, by our estimates, a mean time to failure of 25 years. And we've had over 1 million boxes out in the field, in the jungles in Guatemala, and they have not failed. Like, you cannot put it in a worse condition for electronics. Yeah, because they got rainy season, they're living with mud floors, like that, and they do not fail. And all that happened, like, I'll tell you what happened to go make a thing from the sort of devices that you normally get that last a couple years to a thing that lasts 25 years. It was literally 2 days of work. It was not even very much time. All we needed to do was tell the same electrical engineers, hey, instead of optimizing for absolute lowest cost, we'll still be able to hold that retail price up there. Let's just optimize for longevity. And it took no new retraining, it took no new special skills. We were electrical engineers just like the day before and just like the day afterwards, but we just took a different lens on the thing. That's an example of another shift in consciousness, allowing for a very, very different outcome than what we get from basically the majority of consumer electronics in the world. All right, so I think I'm at time. So I'm going to say thank you. There's a bunch of slides afterwards about where you would plant trees and how you might change like mesoclimate as a function of where you put them, and also how we need to get rid of all the plastic waste, because we actually did as much plastic waste since the year 2004 as we did in all of history before 2004. So things are terrible. But we're not going to cover all that. It's time for questions. Question up front.
I have a microphone.
That guy's got a microphone.
I have 2 questions. One is there going to be a podcast for your lecture number 9 for people who have not attended? Maybe you can have access to it.
If you go to tomchi.com, which is just my name,
Okay.
the first video is a version of this lecture.
All right, great.
And we have recorded also.
Okay.
Oh, good.
And then the second question I have is I really enjoyed your lecture. But we have leaders that think that climate change is a Chinese hoax. So what do we do about that? I mean, we really have to have a leadership to address this crisis.
So, yes, but also maybe, what I'll say is that our overall theory of change around dealing with climate change has been the following. Well, if we can raise awareness enough in order to go get people, passionate and elect the right leaders that are then going to support the right policies that is then going to lead to emission reduction, then we can save the planet. And I'm just going to say, cool theory of change, and also it hasn't worked at all. Right? Because that's the same narrative that we've been chasing since the late 80s. And we did more than half of our carbon emissions since 1991. Right, so like if we knew in the late 80s and we started on that path to try to go limit these emissions, we could have, instead of having 1 trillion ton debt, we could have had 500 billion or less, right? But we basically just continued on and we more than doubled it since the time period that we started with that theory of change. So this is me just putting on my empirical hat and being like, well, that approach probably doesn't work because it didn't work for 30 years. So we need to have another approach. And the approach that I'm going after is things which win by regular market economics and also are radically better for the planet. Now, not everything will be that easy to do in that way. Some things may need to be supported by subsidies, at least for a time period. But as much as possible, let's really dig in there. And also, let's not aim to go for 1.5 or 2 degrees C. People are not talking about this, but 1.5 degrees C is a disaster scenario. Like our models end at the year 2100, but if you trace out the total, that's not the full extent of the warming. It's not done at 2100. We just felt uncomfortable projecting our models past that because there was so much, vociferous debate even up to 2100. But actually, even at, the last time we were at 410 parts per million in the history of the Earth, there was alligators at Alaska's latitude. Like that's the climate that we were asymptoting toward, even at 1.5 degrees C. That may be a world with no polar ice. That may be a world with really, really significant changes when you extend that out to a 500-year as opposed to by the year 2100. So I don't even think 1.5 UBC is actually acceptable to us. I think this is what is politically acceptable to argue about right now. And instead of fighting over a narrative, which is really a type of disaster scenario, why not actually go for what you want? You want to actually eventually pay off the debt and have a planet where we are net positive to nature, as opposed to just limiting damage within a certain range. Oh, there's a bunch of questions. Go for it.
I agree with you in everything that you said. I thought the most interesting thing was what you said that you did in Guatemala.
Oh, thanks.
And the reason that seems to, well, the reason it worked with me was that you changed the way people make money, which is a very powerful incentive.
Yes.
So that, for example, instead of people changing the cell phone every 5 years or every 2 years or every 3 years, sell us a cell phone that does all the things that we want, but don't sell it to us. Let us put a down payment and pay you for 20 years.
Yeah. And then maybe you get a new cell phone after a couple of years, but then I fully reclaim the materials that were in the phone that I gave back.
And by doing that, you can reclaim the material or put the material, give your old cell phone back, get the material and reuse it.
Yes.
And try to update the material and update the cell phone, not by changing the hardware, but by changing the software. This is sort of the model that Tesla has been using in the automobile. Now, I got one other comment.
Oh, yeah, please.
About the cars.
Yes.
You're going to have to do, getting all the cars out of the system means somehow convincing people to trust the car to drive them.
Yeah.
I know the car. Everybody here who knows anything about autonomous driving, you know the car is really better than you because we make more mistakes than the machine makes. They can react faster than we can. But even if that was at level 5,
Yeah.
the question is, can I change my mindset to let my life be in the hands of a machine?
Yeah,
That's
I
a
think it's a good question.
significant mindset difference.
Well, I think part of that is already happening because so many people are using ride sharing, and just a question of, I think it's really much more about familiarity. By the time, like the first time that you get into an Uber, you're like, whoa. Like the 100th time you're in an Uber, you're like, whatever. And same sort of thing, the first time you get into a fully autonomous car, you're gonna be like, whoa. I mean, I was on the team and I was like, wow. But then like after the 100th safety drive, I'm like, well, we're on the road again.
And I use them too.
Yes.
Because people don't walk around.
Because we're in this weird transitional period where people aren't buying less cars yet because of the prevalence of those ride-sharing services. But if you look at the major demographics, like the desirability of cars for people that are under 30, it's fallen off a cliff. Like they want cars about a third as much as like everybody over 30. So it's a pretty significant, and a lot of people are not getting their driver's license even. Sorry, another question.
Hi, yeah, so I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts regarding the tree planting thing you were talking about.
Yes.
Right, so obviously the reason we want to plant trees is that we're a function of like beauty and storing carbon and such. But it seems to me if you just do first principles thinking, like 48% is not a particularly efficient storage. Like I'd like for it to be much closer to 100% storage of carbon.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it would make sense, right, to look at other types of research before we scale up the effort to plant trees, given that like that's resource effort that's spent elsewhere. I'd love to hear what other like options you looked at in terms of research and like, I don't know, startups that offered you, and what made you choose trees as like the best one.
Yeah, well, like just to be clear, it's trees, soils, wetlands, and a little bit of ocean stuff. Those are the ones I ended up on. Now, remember, I'm a physicist and electrical engineer by training. So the thing that I really wanted was it for it to be just a box, like just some device I made. And I'm like, because I know how to make devices and I know how to help people make devices, it's very straightforward. So I was initially attracted to direct air capture. But as I spent time on that, I was like, oh no, this is not going to make it. And this is not to say that there won't be any role for that technology in the future, but here's the reason why I don't think it's going to make it. So with direct air capture, you're making a physical industrial facility. And you can imagine there's an aperture that you're sucking the air through. And that aperture, given that you need to physically build that, is small relative to the size of the Earth, right? So imagine these tiny apertures and whatever, let's say you open up 10,000 of them, even then, it's still a relatively small amount of surface area, on Earth. In order for you to get enough mass flux through there, enough mass through that membrane in enough time, you just need to be sucking air through crazily fast. And I shared this metaphor at lunch, but I think it helps to really make material how much mass we're talking about. So imagine you standing next to a full-size, like 4 or 5-seater car, and the difference in mass between you and the car. So we're familiar with cars, they're way more massive than us, we got it. Now imagine giving every person on Earth, 7.6 billion people, a car like that. And imagine a parking lot of 7.6 billion cars. That's starting to get real massive, right? That's like a really heavy thing. Now imagine taking 7.6 billion cars worth of mass and vaporizing it and turning it into carbon dioxide in the air. That's what we do every year. That's not even a trillion-ton debt yet. A trillion-ton debt is that 7.6 billion car parking lot times like 65. Right? Then you get to that's how much mass needs to get stored through these facilities. So like when you think about the tiny aperture and then try to mechanically build all of that, then you have both a mass storage problem and you have a mass flux problem. You don't have a convenient place to put the mass that you capture because 7.6 billion cars in the parking lot times 65. That's a lot of stuff. And then you don't have enough time to be able to pull enough mass through in terms of mass flux. So the reason for trees, soils, wetlands, ocean is that they all have crazily large surface area. And if you have a large surface area, you don't need to pull through as much. You can pull through at the rate of photosynthesis, and that's actually totally fine. Right? So you can achieve enormous mass flux by huge surface area, tiny draw through, as opposed to tiny surface area, huge draw through. And if you look at the energy consumption of direct air capture, they're using a huge amount of energy to draw the air through. And they're like, well, it's solar power. It's like, well, actually, if you just took that solar power energy and used it to displace some coal-fired power on the grid, you would have saved more carbon emitted than you are successfully pulling down. Right? So like as a true opportunity cost thing and just the viability of pulling it through such a small aperture. So I think at minimum, anything that's going to succeed has got to have a huge aperture. And as much as humanity has built all these things on the planet, less than 1% of the surface area of the planet is built environment. So like, there's just no way. Like we have so much more tree cover, soil cover, ocean cover, every other cover. And that's the totality of everything in the built environment. That's not even just one type of industrial, that's everything humanity's ever built in its history is less than 1% of the land surface of the Earth. So I just don't think we're going to do it through a built thing. It's going to be some sort of, healthy relationship with biology that's going to help us do this, or with rocks, something more physical. Right?
Right, but I could do GMO trees, right? Just say like we genetically modify the trees. All like closer to
well, you can't have a tree that's 100% carbon. So that's just, you got to have hydrogens in there. You got to have a bunch of things. Come on, right? Anyway, so there's that. And also, like, you can GMO a tree, but it's actually better to help each spot on the planet get as close as it can to its climax ecological community, because that actually represents the most sizable carbon storage as an ecosystem. So that should be the ideal goal. And the reason for these tree planting drones is they can actually deliver different seeds. They don't need to plant monocultures, and as a rule, we have we are always planting a collection of species which are appropriate for that stage of ecological succession on the road to maximum biomass, stored as a function of the healthiest ecosystem. And it also drives better resilience, which we're going to need for the next 50 years at least.
Okay,
let me get a stuff in too.
Let me suggest something. Let's keep the Q&A on, but let's move to the hallway. There are refreshments there. But before we do that, please join me in thanking Dr.
And if anybody knows a really rich person that wants to go, or an institution that wants to invest in my fund, then you can go and just email me there. I just need to say it. That's the money line.